What would you do if a locked door unlocked itself from the inside? If a whisper in your home never stopped? Or if a shadow stepped backward into an empty elevator? The human condition is a curious one. We hear footsteps in an empty hallway, and instead of leaving, we investigate. It's rather like mice who walk willingly into the trap, but then again, without curiosity, there would be no stories for me to tell you. Welcome to UnderInkArchives. Let's begin. I started my new job working the night shift as a security guard at an old office building downtown. It was the kind of place that had been around forever. Its foundation settled deep into the city's bones. Its history a heavy silence in the air. Every inch of it carried the weight of its age. Faded floral wallpaper curled at the edges like old parchment. Floorboards groaned under my weight with every step. And the faint, clinging scent of mildew seemed baked into the vents themselves, a permanent fixture in the stale air. My job was straightforward. Make my rounds, check the doors, and log anything unusual. I thought I knew what unusual meant, but I was wrong. I thought I knew what quiet felt like. For the first few days, the job was a predictable routine, a slow rhythm of keys jangling, the soft shuffle of my footsteps, and my flashlight beam cutting a thin, wavering path through the dusty corridors. The building was a place of familiar silence, a perfect, predictable stillness that you expect when a building is actually empty. But in the second week, that silence started to change. It started on the third floor. The long, narrow hallway, a graveyard of empty offices, was a place my flashlight beam wavered ahead of me, slicing through the ruin of blistered paint and tired, threadbare carpets. That's when I first heard it, a whisper. I froze, my hand still on the cold metal doorknob of an empty accounting firm. My mind, trained to find a logical reason for every sound, immediately went to the building. It was the tone of someone standing just around the corner, calling my name. My pulse, a frantic drum against my ribs, thumped so hard I could hear it in my ears. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the cold metal a small comfort in my hand. I swept the beam over the lockers, the break room, the long line of closed doors, but nothing moved. Nothing was there. The whispers didn't happen every night, but when they did, they were relentless. They became a part of my nightly routine, a terrifying punctuation to the stillness. Sometimes they were incoherent murmurs, a jumble of low voices that faded in and out of the darkness. Other times, it felt like someone or something was pacing just behind me a step out of sync, a breath on my neck that wasn't there. Every time I spun around, the hallway was empty. Yet the cold, oppressive presence lingered. It was a cold spot that made the hair on my arms prickle. I became obsessive, timing my rounds, trying to find a pattern. The whispers always appeared near the same cluster of long abandoned offices, past water-stained ceilings and cracked plaster. I would check the security cameras, but they always reported the same thing. No movement, no oddities. My supervisors laughed off the reports, telling me it was the quiet of the building getting to me. I wanted to believe them, but then other signs started to creep in. It began with the little things. I would find a door I was certain I had closed and locked, only to find it slightly open, a silent invitation into the dark. Then a faint scraping along the floor would start behind me, like a shoe dragging against old wood. The subtle shift of air that would make my hair stand on end. I tried to rationalize it all. Drafts, old hinges, fatigue. But the shadow of pursuit pressed close, not urgent, but patient. The way a hunter might wait for its prey to stumble. It was a slow, deliberate stalking. One night, the whispers were different. They were sharper, louder, and impatient. The murmurs thickened into patterns, Not gibberish, not random. It was a message, though I wasn't sure I wanted to understand it. I was reaching the stairwell at the end of the corridor, and the whispers sharpened, beckoning and demanding. My heart hammered, a feverish thrum. I shone my flashlight up the dark steps, but all I saw were shadows pulling into the corners, stretching impossibly long under the weak ceiling light. I felt the chill creep upward, bristling the hair on my neck. I could swear the whispers were moving in rhythm with my heartbeat, slowing when I paused, quickening when I walked. My legs felt heavy, as though invisible hands were tugging at my ankles, anchoring me in place. It wasn't just fear. I felt conscripted, held fast for reasons hidden from me. After that night, I didn't even bother trying to rationalize it anymore. I requested a post closer to the lobby, where the lights were brighter and the air was alive with the hum of electronics. I didn't want to hear the whispers anymore. I didn't want to feel that invisible presence pacing just behind me. For weeks I avoided the third floor entirely, only passing the doorway quickly, my flashlight angled at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought I had escaped. But the silence in the lobby started to feel different. The hum of the computers became a low murmur. The distant sound of a car passing by would sometimes fade into a phantom creaking. I would go home at night, exhausted, only to lie awake in my bed, straining to hear something I knew wasn't there. I could still hear the faint whisper of my name just on the edge of my hearing. Even miles away, the weight of that place lingered, heavy and sour in the back of my mind. Months later, in an offhand conversation with a coworker, I finally mentioned the whispers. I braced myself for either ridicule or polite concern. Instead, she only smiled knowingly. "Oh, you heard them too?" she said, almost casually, as though I had simply ticked a box on some unspoken checklist. She explained that every new night guard did, always in the same hallway, always the same murmurs, as predictable as the ticking of a clock. They even had a name for it, the initiation. We laughed together, the kind of laughter people use to keep things at a safe distance. But the sound rang hollow in my ears, because I knew what I'd heard that night wasn't a prank, or a rite of passage, or anything so harmless. The memory of that suffocating silence, the whispers curling just beyond reach, the oppressive weight of something unseen pressing in on me, it hadn't faded. If anything, knowing I wasn't the only one made it worse, because it meant the whispers were still there, waiting, and no one had ever bothered to figure out why. The haunting of that old building was so subtle it could almost be mistaken for a cruel joke. But what if the supernatural isn't a playful spectator, but a rather rude house guest? Our next case is quite a tidy affair. A house sitter alone with a locked door that simply refuses to obey its basic function. It's a small, quiet act that signals the beginning of a very long night. This file is titled Click, Scratch, Tap. I was house sitting for a friend in an old apartment building while they were away for the night. The place was dripping with character. Narrow hallways, floorboards that grumbled like old men, and heavy wooden doors that seemed to groan under their own weight. There was a faint, clinging scent of dust and old wood in the air. One of those doors caught my attention immediately. It was tucked at the far end of the hallway, small, old-fashioned, and with a tarnished brass lock I had never noticed. It felt wrong, almost like the building had forgotten a piece of its own past. I spent the early evening doing what I usually do, reading on the couch. The only sound, the distant hum of the radiator. The apartment was settling in for the night, and so was I. The building was quiet, the way old places are quiet, with a kind of heavy stillness that feels almost deliberate. Then, from the end of the hall, I heard it. A soft, intentional click from that door. My heart skipped. My first thought was the building settling, the kind of subtle noise you barely notice during the day. But the click came again and again. Each time it was a little louder, a little slower, a little more purposeful, like someone testing the latch from inside. I set my book aside and leaned forward. My senses were now keyed to the slightest sound. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the pipes. I pressed my ear toward the hallway, trying to pinpoint the noise. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching, almost like fingernails dragging across the wooden floor inside the room. My stomach twisted. It was a dry, insistent sound, a slow scrape of something moving over wood. I stepped back, my breath held. Maybe it was rats or some settling beam, but nothing sounded like this. The scraping stopped. I sat frozen for several minutes, straining to hear more. The silence was now a presence in the room, thick and suffocating. Then I heard a soft thump, a gentle thud like a heavy book being dropped, or a chair being nudged lightly. My pulse thudded in my ears, a loud panic drum. I debated calling my friend, but the idea of explaining what I'd heard made my skin crawl. What would I say? Something in your locked closet is moving your furniture? It sounded insane. Instead, I just waited, every mundane sound now amplified. A groan from the ceiling, the hum of the pipes, the distant traffic, but none of it was that sound. By 2 a.m., I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had tried to watch a movie, but every shadow in the corner, every stray whisper of the wind against the window felt like a warning. My anxiety had been building for hours. The noises started again. The rhythm was back, a slow, methodical performance. Click, scratch, tap. My chest tightened. I couldn't sit and listen anymore. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it down the dark hallway toward the locked room. The chair against the far wall, the one my friend used to put his shoes on, was now tipped on its side. The floorboard scuffed as if something heavy had been dragged. I hadn't touched it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. And then, click. The sound came from the lock itself. It was the sound of the key turning slowly, by itself, a perfect quarter turn. It stopped, silent, as though nothing had happened. I didn't move. My legs wouldn't obey me. My lungs felt like they had forgotten how to breathe. I wasn't just hearing it anymore. I was seeing it. With panic rising like fire in my chest, instinct finally took over. I snatched my coat, fumbled for my keys, and clutched my phone as if it were a lifeline. My thumbs shook as I typed out a message to my friend. "I'm sorry, I can't stay another night. Your apartment is just way too creepy." It looked absurd on the glowing screen. Creepy felt like a small, immature word for the suffocating dread that had made the walls themselves seem to lean closer. I didn't wait for a reply. My heart pounded in my ears as I hurried to the door, every step echoing in the oppressive silence, my breath coming short and ragged. I wanted to be outside, in the street, where light and noise and other human beings might remind me that normal life still existed. You might think a locked door is the end of it, a simple little rebellion of hardware. But as any keen observer of the unusual will tell you, when one boundary is crossed, the next inconvenience always arrives on time, often riding in an elevator. It was late. The office building was quiet but not empty. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint clack of my keyboard, and the occasional distant rumble of the city outside. I was the last person on my floor, finishing paperwork, the silence of the space settling in around me. Finally, I saved the last document, shut down my computer, and walked to the elevator bank. I stepped inside the empty car, the cold polished steel of the walls reflecting my tired face. The doors closed smoothly, sealing me off from the rest of the world. I pressed the ground floor button, eager for the cool night air and the comfort of my car. A few moments later, the elevator shuddered and stopped abruptly. My stomach lurched. The lights flickered, casting shadows that danced around me, then settled on a dim, sickly emergency glow. The air in the small space became thick, stagnant. I pressed the ground floor button repeatedly, my thumb a frantic rhythm against the cold plastic. I leaned in and called the intercom. Nothing but a wall of static. At first, I told myself it was just a mechanical glitch. The building was old after all. I leaned back against the wall, trying to breathe normally, to slow my hammering heart. Then I noticed it. A subtle shift in the elevator's weight, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure on the floor, as if someone had entered behind me. I spun around, but the car was empty. I was alone. My heart raced, a wild animal in my chest. I pressed myself against the cold wall, my breath held. The faintest sound, the soft shuffling of feet, the tap of a shoe, echoed in the confined space. I told myself I was overtired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that the sounds were just my imagination. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. They were breathing the same air as I was. The elevator jolted suddenly, throwing me against the panel. My pulse thundered in my ears. After a tense minute, the car started moving again, slowly descending floor by floor. Every sound, the hum of the motor, the slight sway of the car, felt amplified, as if the elevator was whispering secrets. I watched the numbers above the door click down, each one a slow, agonizing second. Finally, the doors opened on the ground floor. I stumbled out, still catching my breath, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The security guard looked up from the front desk, his expression casual, unmoved. "Sorry about the elevator," he said, his voice in normal, welcome sound. "It does that sometimes." I could only nod, my mouth too dry to speak. I thought someone was in there with me," I admitted, still unsure what I had felt. He frowned, glanced down at his monitor, and shrugged. "The cameras show it was just you in there." I nodded, managed a faint smile, and turned to walk out into the cool night air, a much-needed hot shower and some sleep on my mind. I was obviously overtired, and maybe that explained everything. The sensation of being with someone I couldn't see was just my imagination. As I reached the front doors, my hand on the cold brass handle, I saw my reflection in the glass. It wasn't just my reflection. In the dark hallway behind me, I could see a shadow standing just outside the elevator doors. As I watched, the shadow took a slow, deliberate back step and disappeared. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the hallway was empty. The elevator doors had already closed. One polite haunting behind us, we now tiptoe into another, where comfort is merely a suggestion. A place we are told is a sanctuary for wary travelers, a private room where we can let down our guard. But what happens when that room is already occupied? When the quiet is not a comfort, but a presence with a very long memory? The hum of the engine had been a constant companion, a white noise against the backdrop of a relentless rainy city. I was traveling alone for work, covering a small photography festival. A good reason to be here, but not a good enough reason to stay. After hours on crowded streets, I finally arrived at my hotel. It was unassuming, a gray concrete block nestled between a convenience store and an empty lot. Modern enough to feel normal, yet somehow disconnected from the surrounding city. I didn't think much of it until I stepped inside. The lobby was a vacuum of sound, the kind of quiet that feels like a weight on your chest, too quiet for a Friday night. The air was heavy, carrying a faint smell I couldn't identify, clean but with a strange undertone, like paper left in a damp drawer, or old metal. The receptionist handed me a key card without speaking, her expression as flat and gray as the concrete outside. "Room 312, she said, her voice a monotone that broke the silence like shattered glass. She turned away before I could respond. Shrugging off the odd encounter, I headed to the elevator. The hallway to room 312 was a long, narrow corridor, a tunnel of blandness lit by flat, bright overhead lights that seemed to cast no shadow. When I opened the door, the strange metallic scent grew stronger, an intrusive, sour note that made me pause. The room was simple, a bed with a crisply made duvet, a small desk, a dresser. Nothing unusual, but the atmosphere felt wrong, as if the space had been untouched in a particular way, like it had been waiting. I set my bag down and began unpacking my camera gear. That's when I noticed it. A low, irregular vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. Not like an earthquake or the distant rumble of traffic. It was coming from within the room itself, a subtle, almost imperceptible pulse. It was the rhythm of a tired heart. I stopped moving, holding my breath to listen. The moment I became still, the vibration disappeared. Dismissing it as plumbing or the building's structure, I continued unpacking, but the quiet had become a presence. I took a shower, hoping hot water and steam would calm the tension in my muscles. Halfway through, I heard a faint, quick knock. Not at the door, not anywhere near me, but somewhere within the room itself. I froze, water cascading over me. The sound repeated, soft and precise, like someone tapping a fingernail on a thin wall. My skin prickled, and a chill that had nothing to do with the water crept over me. I reassured myself it was nothing, probably just the pipes adjusting. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was impossible to shake. Back in bed, trying to distract myself with my laptop, I began to notice more subtle shifts. The chair at the desk, which I was certain I had pushed in, had shifted slightly, angled as if someone had just risen from it. The position of the desk lamp had changed, though I hadn't touched it. I began cataloging these events mentally, a frantic attempt to find logical explanations. The vibration had to be plumbing. The chair must have been moved by an imperceptible tremor. The lamp was a product of the cleaning staff. Then came the whisper, not a voice, not words, just a breath of air brushing near my ear. A sound so soft, I questioned whether I'd imagined it. I froze, waiting, my skin crawling. Nothing. It was a fleeting moment, but it changed everything. I was no longer an observer, I was a participant. Around midnight, the subtle activities increased. The hum beneath my feet returned, now with a low, steady vibration in the wall behind the bed. Objects on the desk shifted slightly. My notebook slid a fraction of an inch. A pen rolled over. None of these movements alone would cause alarm, but together, these small, precise shifts felt deliberate, like a series of tiny, pointed insults. I tried to sleep, keeping one eye open, the other on the darkest corner of the room. At some point, I sensed movement from the periphery, a shift in light or air. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing was there, but the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by something aware, something with a terrible, silent patience, lingered. I didn't want to investigate further. The silence of the room, once just quiet, had become menacing. I packed my bag, moving as quietly as I could, the rustle of fabric sounding deafening. I left the key card on the desk, a small offering to whatever was in that room, and walked out. The hallway seemed longer than before, the lobby emptier, the air still thick with that strange metallic scent. Outside, the city lights felt unreal, as if I'd stepped into a different world, a sane world. I never returned to that hotel, though I don't claim to understand what I experienced. Ghost, spirit, or simply my mind misinterpreting normal events. It left me weary of silence, of stillness, of rooms that feel like they remember you, even when you've never been there before. Even now, in ordinary spaces, I occasionally notice small, inexplicable shifts, and I remember the subtle, impossible tension of that night. One might think that after witnessing such peculiar disturbances, the imagination would take a well-earned rest, but imagination, like any mischievous tenant, tends to wander, and in this next case, it seems the house itself has decided to remind its occupant that curiosity is best left uninvited. I never believed in ghosts. At least I didn't until the summer I stayed alone in my grandmother's old house. She had passed the year before, and I was left to sort through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to discard. The house smelled of mothballs and old wood, a scent that clung to clothes and hair like a shadow, lingering long after I'd left. Every step I took on the creaking floors reminded me how alive the house still seemed, as if it were breathing around me. The first night I slept there, it began. Around midnight, a soft creak drifted from above. My first thought was that the old timbers were settling, but then it came again, closer this time, followed by a faint shuffle, like someone dragging their feet lightly across the floorboards. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. The attic sat directly above my bedroom, a cramped space I had never explored. The idea of climbing the steep, narrow stairs made my stomach twist with unease, but curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hall, each step muffled by the threadbare rug. The air seemed heavier in the corridor, almost as if it were pressing in, waiting for me to move. The attic door, which had always been locked, now stood cracked open. A shiver ran down my spine. Slowly, I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. My flashlight's beam swept across the dusty floor, forgotten furniture, and stacked boxes. Motions of dust motes danced in the weak light, like tiny stars caught in a slow, invisible current. Everything seemed frozen, yet alive. The quiet pressing against me, thick and suffocating. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye, a small, rough bundle of fabric at the corner of the floor. Kneeling, I picked it up, a doll, small and worn, covered in dust, one button eye missing. I had never seen it before. And then I heard it. A soft, high-pitched giggle, almost a whisper, like a child playing hide-and-seek just beyond my reach. I froze, the air around me tightening as though it were holding its breath. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Shadows clung to corners, cobwebs swaying faintly. But the air, it felt expectant, alive, almost impatient. I left the attic that night, clutching the doll and locking the door behind me. Yet the next morning it sat on my bed, upright, staring at me with its one button eye. The house was supposed to be empty. After that, I hated going into the attic. Even when I had a reason to, the thought of climbing those narrow stairs made my stomach churn. The air seemed thicker there, the shadows darker, every creak sharper, every whisper more urgent. Then one afternoon, months later, I turned toward the attic and froze. In the doorway stood a little girl, no more than 6 or 7, her dress stiff and faded with age.
She didn't move, she didn't blink, but I felt her eyes on me. Curious, sorrowful, almost patient. I turned my head away for a heartbeat, forcing myself to breathe, and when I glanced back, she was gone. Just empty darkness. But the memory of her lingered, sharper than any shadow, like a heartbeat pressed against the back of my skull. I couldn't leave it at that. I began digging into the house's history. It had been built around the turn of the century by a lawyer and his wife. They had 3 children, but one of them, a little girl, had died at 7 from scarlet fever. Reading that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The doll, the giggle, the fleeting glimpse in the doorway, it all began to make a terrible kind of sense. Even knowing the story didn't stop it. On quiet nights, I would hear soft footsteps above me, faint laughter drifting down through the ceiling, and sometimes tiny objects, buttons, scraps of fabric, small toys I didn't recognize, would appear in places I had checked just hours earlier. Now that I know the story of the little girl, I'm not so afraid of her, at least not yet. I still hesitate before climbing the attic stairs, but the fear has shifted into something else, a careful, wary fascination, like keeping company with a memory that refuses to fade. The last story showed us that some ghosts are not a spectacle, but an echo of a life once lived. They watch, they remember, and their quiet presence is enough to unsettle a house and its occupant. But what happens when that quiet echo decides to assert itself? Our next subject discovered that some doors, just like some stories, refuse to be closed. I grew up believing that history was something you read in a book, a series of names and dates contained neatly on a page. It wasn't until I found myself in the humid, oppressive air of Louisiana that I realized history isn't contained at all. It breathes, it lingers, and sometimes it watches. I was visiting a plantation deep in the country, one of those grand, sprawling houses that time has been kind to. Or perhaps it hasn't. From the moment I stepped onto the grounds, I felt an immense weight in the air, not just the crushing heat, but the heavy, humid silence that lay beneath the drone of the cicadas. The house was a masterpiece of peeling paint and faded elegance, its grand columns standing as silent sentinels to a past that was not quiet at all. Our tour guide was a woman whose eyes held a subtle, unsettling glint of amusement. She spoke of the house's former resident, a woman who lived and died within its walls, and who, as the stories went, refused to ever leave. We were promised a ghost story, a little bit of theatrical history, and a good way to spend a sweltering afternoon. As she led us through the formal parlor, she pointed out the evidence: a faint handprint on a dusty mirror in the corner, a rocking chair that seemed to sway just for a moment when no one was looking, a faint scent of old wood and something like candle smoke that lingered no matter where you went. The other tourists chuckled, taking photos, treating it like a show, but I felt something different. I felt the air grow thick, almost sticky, as if the very atmosphere of the house was a presence in itself. It was the feeling of a hush, a deep, pervasive quiet that swallowed the sound of our footsteps and the murmur of conversation, leaving only a strange and heavy stillness. She led us to a small, half-hidden doorway tucked away in the back of a sun-bleached drawing room. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a low tone, "is a secret door a resident used to take to her bedroom upstairs." She smiled and gestured for us to peer inside. The staircase was a thin, crooked ribbon of worn wood, impossibly steep and narrow. The paint on the railing was chipped down to the bare, splintered wood, as if 100 hands had worn it smooth. I lingered at the doorway, utterly fascinated. The rest of the group moved on, their voices fading into a distant murmur as they followed the guide to the next room. I was so absorbed in the history the strange, intimate glimpse into a hidden life that I didn't notice when I was alone. The silence returned with a sudden final presence. The house had fallen into a quiet that was more unnerving than a scream, as if the very air had stopped moving. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the high ceilings, bouncing off the walls like someone else was walking with me a few steps behind. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creaking sound. It was a soft, steady groan, a rhythmic sound that broke the silence with an almost lazy malice. My gaze darted from the shadows to the half-hidden staircase. I looked up to the unseen room at the top of the stairs and back to the door that led to it. The door was moving. Slowly, a fraction of an inch at a time, but with a deliberate, unnerving purpose. It wasn't a quick, nervous swing of a door in a breeze. This was a slow, measured, and certain motion, as if something unseen was guiding it, inch by inch. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, frantically scanning the area. No breeze, no open windows, no draft, nothing to explain the movement of a solid oak door that must have weighed 100 pounds. Just the door, moving with a silent, subtle insistence. A silent invitation to a room I couldn't see. Panic shot through me, and I ran, my heart hammering in my chest, the rhythm of my footsteps echoing in the high ceilings as I fled toward the front of the house. The echoes were loud and mocking, a chorus of phantoms I hadn't seen, but I was certain they were there. I found the guide in the main hall, her back to me, smiling as she described a portrait to a group of bored-looking tourists. I clutched my chest, gasping for breath, unable to find the words. She turned and saw my frantic expression, and a flicker of something passed through her eyes. A strange, knowing spark that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She smiled, calm and unconcerned. "Doors open and close by themselves all the time," she said, her voice a soothing murmur. "Even really heavy doors. You'll see it everywhere in this house." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to laugh it off as an old house settling, a trick of the light. But my mind kept returning to that slow, deliberate movement, to the sensation that something unseen had been watching me, guiding me, waiting. It hadn't been an accident. The group hadn't slipped away. I had been given a moment alone. I left the house shortly after, but the memory stayed with me. It isn't the sight of a spirit that haunts me, but the chilling sense of an intelligence behind the veil. Even now, I can still feel the hush of that room, the weight of the air, the subtle, terrifying insistence of that door. A silent warning and a gentle reminder that in places like that, you never know what's waiting to close the door behind you. One might believe a door can be trusted to stay put, a simple mechanism of wood and hinges. But life, or whatever lurks in old houses, is fond of reminding us that stability is just an illusion. Some houses prefer a subtler touch, whispering through walls and plumbing, offering a quieter sort of menace. And of course, there are those who mistake it for the humdrum of domestic chores. But in the right or wrong house, even laundry can become an invitation to terror. I bought the house because it was old. Built in the early 1900s, it had a kind of character that just felt right. The floors creaked in a certain way, the light slanted through the windows at a perfect angle, and the scent of aged wood and old books made it feel like home. For nearly a year, I lived here in perfect quiet, convinced I had found my dream home. I'd never noticed anything unusual, not a single thing. The laundry area is in the basement. The previous owners had done a good job of finishing it. They painted the walls a calming beige, installed track lighting, and put in a comfortable little chair for folding. It was a perfectly normal, well-lit room, so I was never afraid to go down there, even late at night. The only thing that made it feel like a basement was the faint lingering scent of damp soil. One night, the only sound was the familiar hum of the washer and the soft tumble of the dryer. I was leaning against the wall, scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from inside one of the walls. It was a methodical, rhythmic sound, and it was too big to be a mouse or a rat. It was a scraping, a gnawing, and it was coming from under the stairs. I put my phone in my pocket and leaned closer, my ear pressed against the wall, trying to pinpoint the noise. Just as I got close enough to feel the faint vibrations, a single light bulb directly above me gave a violent pop, showering me with glass. The sound jolted me, but not like in the movies. It was just sudden, unnatural. Before I could even process it, the other 3 lights in the room blew out in a rapid succession of pops. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The only sound was the distant hum of the appliances and my own ragged breathing. Fumbling for the railing, I made it upstairs to grab a flashlight and replacement bulbs. I checked the breaker and reset it. I replaced the bulbs, swept up the shattered glass, and the scratching continued, faint but steady behind the wall. I wasn't scared yet, just utterly exhausted and annoyed. Laundry still needed folding. I grabbed the basket and brought it upstairs, leaving the basement to its shadows. The next day, I called a friend who's an electrician. He agreed to stop by that evening, a puzzled look on his face as I explained what had happened. Once he arrived, I showed him the basement, and while he worked, I ordered pizza. The smell of pepperoni and garlic bread soon filled the house, and by the time he finished, the pizza had arrived. I grabbed a couple of beers, handed him a plate, and finally noticed how shaken he looked. He was pale, his hands were trembling slightly as he held his beer. After a few minutes, he said, "I thought you didn't have kids." I put my slice down, confused. "I don't," I replied. "Why do you ask?" He explained that while he was working, he kept hearing a little girl's voice. She was calling his name. He kept turning around, but there was never anyone there. Then it would happen again, the voice calling his name, a child's laugh echoing, always just out of sight. He laughed nervously, saying I was lucky I'd given him beer because otherwise he would have been mad at me for playing tricks. I told him I wasn't joking. There were no kids in the house. The blood seemed to rush from my head. I told him about the lights and the scratching. He just stared at me, his eyes wide. Then he slowly nodded. We finished the pizza, had another beer, and he left. I knew I wasn't imagining it, and that certainty was more terrifying than 100 strange noises. Later that evening, the house had settled into a quiet I had come to love. I was in the shower, the hot water a comforting blanket against my skin, when I heard it. Footsteps, pacing the stairs. I paused the water to listen. A shadow flickered in the bathroom, a dark, fleeting shape. I peeked out from behind the curtain. Nothing. The door was still closed. I finished quickly, stepped out, and wiped the mirror. In the fogged glass, I thought I saw a little girl standing just behind me. She was staring, frowning, a faint dark smudge against the steam. I spun around. No one. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. I leaned on the sink, sighing, trying to convince myself I was just tired. Maybe the beer had dulled my senses. Then came the laughter, loud, echoing from downstairs. It was the laughter of children, sharp and cruel. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated anger. I ran down, yelling that I'd call the cops if any neighborhood kids were in my house. The laughter stopped just before I reached the kitchen. Doors and windows were all locked, every single one. I checked them twice. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. Exhausted, I turned to go back upstairs, but the basement door handle slowly turned. My breath hitched. The door creaked open, and children's laughter drifted from the utter darkness below. I flicked the light on at the top of the stairs and stepped down, calling out, ready to confront whoever it was. As soon as my foot hit the second step, all 4 lights blew again, one after the other. Glass shattered across the floor. Then I heard it, a voice. Deep, guttural. Not a child's voice at all. It was a man's voice, and it was calling my name. Christina. I didn't hesitate. I ran up the stairs, slammed the door, and shoved a chair under the handle. Then I called the cops. I waited outside in my bathrobe, pacing the front lawn. A kind female officer stayed with me while the others went inside. A few minutes later, they came back out. They told me the house was empty and no one was in there. I begged them to check again. One officer suggested maybe I'd had a little too much to drink and should sleep it off. I knew then I was alone. No one would believe me. I went back inside, tense and afraid, but I managed a few hours of sleep that night. The hauntings haven't stopped. The noises are a part of the house now. People tell me I should move, that I should just leave, but it's my home, and I don't want to. Of course, one might assume that hauntings are happiest lurking behind locked doors, confined to the domestic sphere where they can tangle with laundry baskets and electrical wiring. But some spirits, it seems, prefer a more dramatic entrance. Why settle for a basement when you can have steel beams, fog, and the soothing lullaby of a restless river? And so we leave the familiar creaks of home behind, stepping instead into a place where the past flows as relentlessly as the water itself. I grew up in the shadow of the river. My childhood was spent wandering the edges of the small town where the Mississippi carved its way through the land. I used to watch barges drift silently past and listen to fishermen's tales about the river's moods and mysteries. The water was always there for me, sometimes calm and welcoming, other times dark, unfathomable, and frightening in a way I couldn't explain. Years later, I found myself returning to that same riverbank, my footsteps tracing paths I knew by heart but had avoided for years. My grandfather had just passed, a river pilot who filled my childhood with stories about restless spirits and hidden tragedies. His absence had pulled me back here tonight, though I wasn't sure if I was looking for answers or just a little solace. The night wrapped around me like a cold cloak as I stepped onto the worn metal walkway beneath the old steel bridge. The air was thick with moisture, heavy with the scent of rust, wet wood, and the faint tang of riverweed carried on the current. Every footfall sent a sharp clang echoing through the stillness, a harsh sound against the hush that usually swallowed noise in this place. Above, the great arches loomed, dark and skeletal against the overcast sky, their rusted beams crisscrossing like the ribs of some ancient beast. My breath misted in shallow clouds as I edged closer to the rail, peering down into the oily black water swirling around the bridge's pillars. The city lights twinkled far off, a faint glow that barely pierced the night. Here I felt suspended between water and sky, cut off from everything familiar. I paused, heart beating in rhythm with the steady drip of water falling from the beams above. The river rippled softly, disturbed only by the occasional splash of something unseen beneath. That's when I heard it. At first, it was nothing more than a shift in the night. The air seemed to tighten, pressing in from all sides, carrying the cold damp of the river and the faint metallic tang of rust. The wind stirred the old steel beams above me. The water whispered against the pilings, and the distant hum of the city seemed to fade into an uneasy silence. Then beneath it all, I heard whispers. Faint, fragile, almost teasing in its delicacy. It threaded itself through the rustling of the mist, slipping between the clatter of water and the creak of metal, impossible to locate, impossible to ignore. It was a sound caught between memory and imagination, like the edges of a forgotten thought brushing against my mind, leaving a shiver in its wake. The whispers persisted, subtle but insistent, curling around me, drawing me closer to the shadows beneath the bridge. Every instinct told me to move, to flee, but my feet felt rooted to the walkway, as if something unseen had claimed them. holding me in place to listen, to understand, to witness. My pulse quickened, the hairs on my arms prickling as the temperature dropped suddenly, a cold breath that seemed to seep out of the bridge itself. I hugged my jacket tighter, the fabric crackling loud in the silence. Mist rose thick off the river, curling and twisting until it clung to the surface like ghostly tendrils. Shapes seemed to stir within it, flickering and shifting among the steel girders overhead. And then footsteps. Slow, uneven, hesitant. They echoed on the metal beneath me, out of place, breaking the rhythm of the night. I swallowed hard, scanning the mist, the beams, every corner of the bridge where shadows could hide, and that's when I saw her. She emerged from the fog as if it had been holding its breath, a pale silhouette slowly materializing from the swirling gray. The air wrapped around me, sticky with river mist, and carried the faint rhythmic drip of water from somewhere up above. Every step she took seemed cushioned by the fog, yet the sound of her presence was impossible to ignore, like a faint brush of silk against stone, almost imagined, almost not. Her clothes hung in tatters, fluttering like brittle leaves caught in a wind that didn't exist. Every movement was deliberate, measured, as if the air itself resisted her presence. The faint scent of wet earth and decaying wood clung to her, sharp and unmistakable, mingling with the metallic scent of the river. My chest tightened, my breath catching as I tried to convince myself she wasn't real. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, reflecting the dim, diffused light of the mist. Dark hair clung in tangled ropes across her face, shifting with the fog so that one moment it concealed her features, the next revealed them with a clarity that made my stomach twist. Her eyes locked onto mine, black pools of sorrow that seemed to draw the warmth from the air, leaving everything brittle and cold. I felt the weight of it, the gravity of her grief pressing down, and I realized that I had stepped into a space where the past had not released its hold. She lifted a hand, trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a kind of terrible insistence. Her fingers were thin, fragile, like broken twigs held together by sheer will, moving with a patience that felt almost eternal. The fog swirled around her, curling in on itself like smoke, thickening the night, muffling distant sounds of the city. The clanging of my own footsteps on the metal walkway seemed to echo too long, distorted as if the bridge itself remembered every past terror it had witnessed. The river beneath me whispered, its water lapping against the pillars in soft, irregular splashes that seemed to echo her presence. Every breath I drew was heavy and cold, tasting of iron and mist. The fog shifted again, wrapping the steel girders and the walkway in a dense, quivering shroud. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, holding its movement so that I was alone with her, suspended in a stillness that vibrated with quiet menace. And still she waited, hand raised, silent, patient, the very embodiment of a memory that refused to fade, a summons I could neither ignore nor understand. My own hand rose almost instinctively, reaching toward her. A part of me wanted to step forward, to follow, to see where this invitation might lead. The river mist thickened, curling around us, muffling everything except the pull of her presence, the tug of a memory made flesh. And then a horn, a harsh, urgent blare cutting across the still night. The sound came from the far end of the bridge, announcing to anyone that the narrow span was about to be occupied. The spell broke in an instant. My gaze was yanked away from her, linking toward the glaring headlights of the approaching car, the driver's impatience echoing through the still. I turned back to her, desperate, and the fog had swallowed her whole. She was gone, just empty gray curling around the girders, and my hand hovered midair, fingers outstretched to nothing. Then came the wails, low at first, then rising in a crescendo of grief and rage, echoing off the steel, clawing at my chest. My stomach lurched, and the river's soft splashes seemed to join the chorus of despair. Now aware, no longer entranced, fear gripped me fully. I spun and ran, my footsteps clanging against the metal walkway, the sound swallowed by the mist but urging me forward. I didn't dare look back, not until I was safely in the harsh yellow glow of the streetlights at the far end of the bridge. I never went back to that bridge after dark. And that, dear viewer, concludes this week's little inventory of the inconveniently unexplainable. Whispers, shadows, locks that have minds of their own. The mundane, as it turns out, is surprisingly rude. Should you happen to witness the impolite behavior of your own walls or locks, send word through the link in the description below. Subscribe to remain a willing witness. I'll be back next week with a new case file. But for now, the archives are closed.